All right, welcome to the deep dive. If you're here with us today, you're probably looking to up your embroidery game, right? And specifically, you want to get a handle on 3D puff embroidery. We're going to take a deep dive into that today using, well, frankly, a really fantastic guide we found.
Absolutely. And we know you want to get into the meat of it without wasting any time, but still get a thorough understanding. So we've really done the legwork and distilled things down to the core principles.
Now, if you're just getting started, 3D puff embroidery is basically what gives some of those embroidered designs. You know, the ones, that awesome raised look. It's everywhere, really makes logos pop on things like baseball caps and jackets. It looks so premium, you know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. And our main goal today is to give you the key aspects of 3D puff embroidery so that when you take on your next project, you feel totally confident doing it without getting bogged down in all the technical details.
Sounds good to me. So let's jump right in. What is, at its core, 3D puff embroidery?
Well, essentially, you're putting a layer of foam, like a special type of foam, underneath your embroidery thread. Then your embroidery machine stitches right through it. And once the design is done, you carefully tear away the excess foam, and boom, you've got that raised embroidered area.
It's wild how transformative that one extra layer can be. No wonder it's so popular for caps, teamwear, all that branded stuff. It just catches the light so well and adds like another dimension.
Exactly. And one thing to understand is that the foam is actually cut and shaped by the needle penetrations along the edges of your design. And this is why it's so important to get the digitizing right from the get-go. If you want those crisp edges, you need that precision.
So it's all about precision. Now let's talk materials and equipment, right? Foam's obviously a big one. What kind should we be using?
You'll want to go for a 3mm high-density foam for the cleanest results. Madeira's Bodybuilder is good, and so is G-Old brand. Yeah. That higher density, it's key because the foam cells are tighter, so the needle can slice through nice and clean. You don't want it to, just squish or tear like you might see with some of those less dense craft foams.
Makes sense. You want a nice clean cut, not a messy one. What about the color of the foam? Do we need to be picky about that?
Color matters, yeah. Most of it's going to be covered up by the thread, but if you can match the foam color to your thread color, it helps hide any little bits that might peek through. It just makes the final product look so much more polished.
Good tip. Now, needles, obviously a big part of this. Can we just use any old embroidery needle?
Not really. For 3D puff, you really want to use Grossbecker KK needles, size 7511 or 8012 or what you're looking for.
Right.
They're designed a little differently. You got a shorter shank and a longer blade, which is better for going through all that foam.
So why is that design so important? What kind of issues could come up if we just use regular needles?
Well, a regular needle, because the shank is longer, it can sometimes go too deep when it's going through the fabric and the foam, right? And, well, that can cause the needle to hit the needle plate, and then you've got thread breaks, maybe even some damage to your machine. The KK needle, with that shorter shank, it helps avoid all that. The longer blade makes sure it can still get through all the layers.
So it's all about preventing those mechanical issues. What about thread? Does it matter what kind we use when stitching through the foam?
Yes, a good quality polyester thread is generally your best bet. Polyester is known for being strong and durable. And that's key here because your thread's going to be going through a lot of friction with the foam. You don't want it fraying or breaking on you.
Gotcha. Now, apart from the machine and all that, is there any other equipment we absolutely need for professional-looking 3D puff embroidery?
You'll want a heat gun for the finishing touches. After you tear away most of that excess foam, you can use a heat gun to shrink any tiny bits that are still sticking around. That's how you get those really crisp, clean, professional 3D results. Just remember to keep it moving so you don't overheat anything.
Heat gun makes sense to get that perfect finish. Any other, maybe, less obvious tools we could use?
Have you ever heard of using rubber bands for puff embroidery? Mike Doe from Elko, he's got this great technique where you use a rubber band to hold the foam in place on your hoop while the machine's stitching. It's way safer and more consistent than trying to use your fingers.
The rubber band trick, that's clever. Keeps your fingers safe, too. Last thing on materials, backing. Anything specific we should keep in mind, especially on a cap?
Even on structured caps, good quality backing is a must. It gives the fabric that extra stability so it doesn't move around too much. Prevents thread shredding, especially with all that extra bulk and tension from the foam. Don't skimp on the stabilizer.
Got it. The stabilizer is crucial. So we've got our materials and equipment down. Now, digitizing for puff, this seems important. I'm guessing we can't just grab any embroidery file and expect it to work in 3D. What kind of adjustments do we have to make?
Yeah, you're right. You usually need to tweak regular embroidery designs to get them to work well in 3D Puff. One big thing is how the software handles open ends.
For those of us who aren't digitizing pros, what are open ends? Maybe an example or something.
Sure. So when you're digitizing, you're creating shapes on letters, often with satin stitches, those really tight, smooth stitches that outline designs, right? And sometimes those stitches just end at the edge of a shape. Imagine an unsealed edge of fabric where the threads aren't in a continuous loop. In regular embroidery, it's usually fine, but with puff, we need those needle penetrations to cut the foam all the way around. So those open ends need some special attention for a clean cut.
Okay, I get it. So how do we fix these open ends when we're digitizing for puff? I know there are a couple of different techniques.
Yeah, capping and pinching are the main two. Let's start with capping. You add a little, usually horizontal satin stitch to close off or cap the open ends of satin stitch shapes. Like if you're doing the letter E, you'd add little horizontal stitches at the end of each of those 3 horizontal bars.
So it's like those caps give it a finished edge, so the needle cuts the foam clean. Do you use specific settings for those caps, like density?
You usually want to use a lower density for the caps than for the main design, something around 2.5 points. The main satin stitch might be around 1.7, just as a reference, and you want to make sure you turn on random edge on the inside of the cap.
Random edge. What's that do?
It basically makes the needle penetrations along an edge slightly random, so it's not a perfectly straight line. You want this on the inner edge of the cap because, well, we only want a clean cut on the outer edge where it needs to separate from the foam. Random edge on the inside stops the cap itself from cutting into the foam underneath. We don't want that.
That's clever. So capping's for the more defined edges? What about pinching? When would you use that?
Pinching is good for, like, script lettering or designs with curvy, organic shapes, thinner stuff generally. Instead of a separate cap, you change the angle of the satin stitches right at the end of the shape, usually about 45 degrees inwards. And that's enough to cut the foam without a separate cap.
So capping for structured shapes, pinching for flowy stuff. Is pinching especially good for thinner design elements?
Absolutely. It works really well for those fine lines and curves where a cap would look, I don't know, too clunky.
Mm-hmm.
Capping, on the other hand, is good for those thicker block letters where you need that solid end. It's interesting, some fonts are just better for puff than others. Like Design Shop's Old English font, it already has those pinched ends built in, so you barely have to tweak anything for puff embroidery.
That's a great tip. The font itself can make things easier. Now, sharp angles like 90-degree intersections, I know those can be tricky with puff. How do we deal with those so the foam doesn't poke through at the corner, like the letter T, for example?
Those 90-degree corners, yeah, they can be a pain. One thing that works is to put a very small satin stitch with a random edge right across the intersection. It's almost like a little bridge that keeps the foam down without cutting it right at the corner.
Kind of like a little patch. Are there any other ways to handle those sharp corners?
You can also slightly change the angle where the lines meet. Just a little shift away from a perfect 90 degrees can help a lot. And then there's Scott Stengel. He's a big advocate for sealer stitches. They're basically a few manual back and forth stitches right across the seam to lock it down.
Sealer stitches, I like it. Good reinforcement. Okay, what about underlay? With regular embroidery, the underlay stitches kind of create a foundation. Do we do the same for puff?
For puff, it's actually best to minimize or even skip underlay in the areas you're raising. Underlay can compress the foam before you even do the main stitching, and that can make the 3D effect less pronounced. So yeah, usually turn off or at least really reduce underlay for anything that's going to be puffed up.
That's interesting. Totally different than what we're used to. Last thing on digitizing, density. You touched on it with capping. How does the density for puff compare to regular embroidery?
You need a much higher density for puff, yeah. Usually somewhere between 1.7 and 1.9 points. That's almost double the density of a normal satin stitch. And that's because you need a lot of needle penetrations to cut through the foam cleanly. If you don't have enough, you're going to end up with ragged edges.
High density for clean cuts. Got it. Okay, digitizing's done. Now, setting up the machine, any special adjustments for puff embroidery?
Definitely a few things to keep in mind. First, like we mentioned earlier with the digitizing holds, make sure the puff part of your design is the last thing to be stitched.
So if we have a logo, let's say, with flat text and a raised emblem, the flat stuff gets stitched first.
Exactly. Do all your flat stuff first, and then the machine pauses. That's your cue to put the foam down, and then it'll go ahead and stitch the puff parts. You need to program a stop command in the machine. In iOS, for example, you do that in the color sequence settings.
So that pause is crucial. What about speed? Does that change for puff?
It's generally a good idea to slow things down when you're doing puff. Something like 750 to 800 stitches per minute is a good starting point. It just gives you more control when you're dealing with the extra thickness and resistance of the foam. Helps with smoother stitches and cleaner cuts.
Slower is better. Got it? Presser foot height? Anything to watch out for there?
Big one, yes. When your machine stops for you to put the foam down, you've got to raise the presser foot all the way up. You need the clearance for the foam, otherwise it'll get squished before you even start stitching. You want to keep that full foam height for the 3D effect.
Presser foot up before the foam goes down. Got it. Any particular feed settings we might need to adjust, especially for caps?
Yeah, with caps, you'll probably want to tweak your feed settings. A good starting point is like 16 to 18 for the lower feed limit and around 65 for the upper limit. This just helps to keep the cap from getting pulled too hard by the feed dogs during the puff stitching. You don't want any weird distortion. And if you're using 4mm foam instead of 3mm, you might want to bump that lower feed limit up by 10 or so.
Good to know. And you mentioned before that some software has like built-in settings for puff, right?
Right. In AMI OS, which is part of the MCOOS software, you can usually select a 3mm puff for the color that's going to be stitched with foam. And that will tweak some of the settings automatically to work better with 3mm puff. It's a good starting point. Take some of the guesswork out.
Nice, makes things easier. Okay, machine setup. Let's talk about the actual process, stitching with the foam. Any key steps or things to watch out for?
Tight hooping, that's number one, especially for caps. You don't want any movement or shifting while it's stitching the puff elements. That can really mess things up.
You mentioned Richardson caps earlier. Why are they a good choice?
Richardson caps, they tend to be really consistent in how they're made, and they hoop really well. That makes them more predictable, which is what you want for puff. And, having a good, consistent material to start with definitely makes everything smoother. When you're hooping the cap for puff, flatten that bill all the way out on your hooping device. That just helps get a nice even placement and prevents any distortion from a curved bill.
Flattening the bill, got it. Anything else we need to do to the cap itself before we put it on the machine?
Always take out that cardboard insert they put in new caps before you hoop it. If you accidentally stitch through that, it can really damage your machine, especially the hook area. Also, pulling the sweatband out of the way helps, especially if your design's close to the bill. That way it doesn't get in the way of the hooping or stitching.
Good tips. Definitely want to avoid those problems. Now, the rubber band trick we talked about. Can you walk us through how to do that? When do we put it on? How do we do it?
Okay, so you've hooped your garment. The machine has stitched any flat elements, and it's stopped where you programmed it to. Now you take your piece of 3mm foam and place it exactly where the puff embroidery is going to be. Then take a regular rubber band and stretch it around the whole hoop, making sure it goes right over the foam, holding it down against the fabric.
So it's like a clamp to keep that foam from moving.
Exactly. It keeps the foam in place after those first stitches have laid down the outline for the puff area, but it's flexible enough so it doesn't get in the way of the needle. Then, before you start stitching the puff part, make sure you raise that presser foot all the way up again.
Presser foot up. Always. So the puff embroidery's done. What's the best way to get rid of all that extra foam?
You carefully tear away the excess. Just make sure you pull in a direction that doesn't put stress on your stitches. Then there'll probably be some tiny bits left behind. That's when you break out the heat gun.
The heat gun for the final cleanup. How do we use that effectively?
Just apply a gentle heat, keep it moving. The heat will shrink those little bits of foam so the edges look really clean and defined. Don't hold the heat in one spot for too long, especially on synthetics like polyester, or you could scorch or even melt the fabric.
Gentle and moving. You mentioned heat also affects the thread a little bit.
Yeah, the heat can make the polyester thread shrink, just a tiny bit. This makes the design a little tighter, more crisp. It's a subtle detail, but it makes a difference.
I love how all of these little details work together. Now, for beginners, what are some common mistakes and how can they troubleshoot them?
A big one is when the foam doesn't cut cleanly. Almost always this comes down to the digitizing. Either not enough density or not enough needle penetrations right on those cutting lines.
Yeah.
Go back and tweak your digitizing. That's usually the fix.
Ragged edges, check the digitizing. What about thread breaks? What causes those with puff?
A lot of times it's the wrong needle. Or if the presser foot isn't high enough when it's going over the foam, that puts a lot of stress on the thread and it can snap. Always double check that presser foot height.
Needles and presser foot. Got it. We talked about foam poking through at the seams, especially those 90-degree corners. How do we deal with that?
If you're seeing foam poking through, it's usually a digitizing problem. You need to go back to your software and try some of the techniques we talked about. A small satin stitch with random edge across the intersection, Scott Stingle's sealer stitches, maybe adjust the stitch angles.
So digitizing is really key here. What about using puff on regular clothes, like t-shirts? Anything different we need to know?
You can do it, but you've got to think about how the garment's going to be used. If it's going to be washed a lot and rub against things like a t-shirt, you'll want to use shorter stitches so the design is more durable. But honestly, you should consider if puff is the right choice at all for those types of garments. Puff designs, because they're raised, they're just more prone to wear and tear compared to regular flat embroidery, especially with all the washing and wearing.
So puff is better for things that don't get washed as often. Caps and decorative items seem like the best bet.
Yeah, exactly. Puff looks awesome on caps, bags, things like that, where you really see that 3D effect and you're not worried about it getting ruined in the wash.
Any last tips or tricks for people who are going to be doing a lot of puff embroidery?
If you're going to be doing a lot of caps, create a bunch of cap outlines in your digitizing software. That way, every time you start a new design, you don't have to redraw the whole cap. Just import your template and focus on the design itself. Saves a lot of time.
That's a smart idea. Well, we've covered a lot today. Materials, equipment, digitizing, machine setup, troubleshooting, even some tips for working with different garments. We've really gone deep.
Hopefully now you have a much better grasp on 3D puff embroidery and you feel ready to give it a shot. There's some specific things to learn, but the results are so worth it. Puff embroidery, it just makes your designs stand out.
And don't forget, the guide we use for this deep dive has even more detail, pictures, all that good stuff. So definitely check it out if you want to know more.
Yeah, explore the possibilities. 3D puff embroidery, it really can add that extra dimension to your work.
So, as you're thinking about your next embroidery project, imagine what puff embroidery could do. Could you use it in unexpected ways, maybe on something other than a cap or a jacket? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.